Good morning, everyone. Shall we get started? Just as a public service announcement before we move on to our first item in the agenda here, tomorrow, I believe, is our code freeze date for the 129 release. That means we should expect a 129 release candidate out in the not too distant future. Do any of our release managers have any requests, updates, or announcements they wanted to share with regard to that?
There is a thread in the Release 1.29 channel with a list of PRs, some of them on Master, some on 129. Francisco, who is the primary release manager, said that we need one more push before tomorrow afternoon EU time. They'll be starting code freeze and during the first RC as late as possible to allow getting these PRs in. And there are quite a few of them. So for maintainers who have approval, please take a moment and check the message. I can link it here in the chat and just check GitHub to see if there's anything outstanding that could use user reviews.
All right. Thanks for that. It'll be good to see the release candidate out and be able to talk about what we've accomplished in this release. I think our first item on the agenda for today comes from Brendan, who's shared some information about adopting ambient in the past, and I think has a few more discussions. Brendan, you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Do you mind if I share my, or yeah, this is fine.
Okay.
So can we do the other one first? It starts,
Absolutely.
It ends at 8:1. Yep. So, yeah, like Mitch said, I've had some interactions in the Monday meeting previously around our adoption of ambient, and there are two main blockers for us that we're looking to address upstream, and they're both kind of centered around like ambient and Envoy parity. There are things we've been able to do in Envoy that we can't necessarily do yet in ambient. So one of the first things I want to talk about is this. We have this setup where we have two NICs within the pods network namespace, and there's a team within the cloud provider that we work with that handles this. It's not a public facing feature, and it's not really the typical use case you would see where there's like a gateway or like an ingress gateway, or it's kind of like a special feature where the customer delegates this subnet to the service, and then it provides this NIC directly in the pod network namespace that's non-ephemeral, so it's persistent across restarts, and it allows like this direct connectivity to the customer network. Can you scroll down a little bit? So the problem that we're facing is the default route is ETH1, which is the customer's network, and then there are other routes. Basically, the cluster's network defaults to ETH0. So only addresses within the cluster network default to ETH0, while all others default to ETH1. And there are use cases where we want non-network traffic to go out ETH0. So we've worked with the team responsible for this feature, and we've decided on this IP rule, the second one up here, that says like if any request comes in from the ETH0 address, it'll default to ETH0 despite the destination. So it's like this policy-based routing where we're using source address binding. I guess I'll pause there and see if there's any questions with what I've said so far. So if you scroll down, I'm going to skip this sidecar envoy section. Actually, the Z tunnel. So basically what we're trying to get at is we want Z tunnel when it receives an outbound connection to honor the source peer address from the downstream. And if you click on this link, this capability was previously built in. So it looked like there was some aspect of this previously that was disabled for a different feature reason. But it used to, like the Z tunnel used to look at the source peer address and then call like free bind connect using it. And now it doesn't do that anymore. And I think it was under the same enable original source flag or environment. So we're trying to see if we can add back this capability, maybe under a new environment, like enable outbound original source or something, so that our policy-based routing rules work with Z-tunnel in the picture. So like we have applications, some might bind to ETH0, some might bind ETH1, and we want these requests that when they go to Z-tunnel to honor that source address and also bind to the same that the application is using, because there's these two interspaces within the pods network namespace. So I guess I created this discussion to kind of lay out the details and see what would be good next steps, or if the problem is understood and how we could potentially solve this upstream.
And I think, Brendan, you've come to this community before with this same sort of problem and proposed the solution that you all used in Sidecar, which was to allow particular network devices to be non-captured using pod annotations. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think we kind of indicated that we were not really interested in going down that path because we want the ambient proxy to be non-bypassable, so that you can have like egress controls and inspection and things like that. So this is a way of enabling the multi-NIC use case while also not allowing arbitrary bypass of the Z-tunnel. Is that right?
Yeah, the arbitrary bypass was the next discussion tab, the first one you brought up. So this one is just, this discussion like post here is just scoped to being able to do this outbound spoofing, I guess, when we have these two network interfaces. And then the next discussion, if you want to just pop over to that one was around excluding, adding some form of exclusion that's acceptable. And I've come across a couple threads where people have requested this, and it's something that the community, I think, wants to avoid as much as possible, especially at the pod annotation level. But we do have specific use cases where if traffic is redirected on inbound, some of the protocols we want to provide, functionality we want to provide to the customer breaks for legacy reasons. I can go into that a little bit more, but I kind of wanted to just see if this first topic kind of like resonates with anyone, if it's something that I'm definitely open to contributing and helping push this along also, but just trying to get a pulse on what this seems like for others.
Can I double check to make sure I understand?
Yeah.
So there are three if you include localhost, but two NICs that we care about in the pod network namespace. And then sometimes you go to one, sometimes you go to the other. The problem is that Z-tunnel is always using like ETH0 or ETH1 as for its source address.
So yeah, the problem for us is Z-tunnel is unopinionated in what it uses, so it just uses the default route, and so this, if you go up, Mitch, this rule that we add, that eventually the cloud provider will add, that 327631, that one is the one that we want to sort of allow Z-Tunnel to utilize.
Mhm.
But
So, like for example, the tunnel would, when it gets a connection, it would check the peer, and if it's from each 0 IP address, it would, when it creates a new socket, the socket would be bound to the each 0 IP address.
yeah, that's the change we want to happen. Right now, it doesn't do any sort of free bind, or it doesn't call any sort of bind on the peer address. So then
Mhm.
the default route is just selected by the kernel or the network namespace configure.
It sounds pretty reasonable to me, because you're keeping an aspect of the connection the same.
The only sort of thing I think that I was wanting to understand is why the functionality was taken away. Previously, I think John is here and he might have made the change. It was like a while ago, but I guess just figuring out the reason why it was removed and making sure that use case is honored, which is why I was kind of thinking maybe adding it back conditionally under an environment or something.
Yeah, that's a fair concern. I don't know why it was removed. Well, I like to add, this isn't free bind, this is just bind, right?
Yeah, I'm saying freebind because that's the method name, but I might be making like that's the method name Z-Tunnel uses, but it might be more confusing to say it like that.
Because for free bind, you're binding to an address that doesn't exist locally. Or for bind, you are. So I
Yeah.
guess I'm just thinking in terms of connection tracking, and it wouldn't
Yeah.
have any implications on that either.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Looking through this pull request, I think this happened around the time that we changed the way that Z-Tunnel traffic was going to be captured in terms of in-pod capture versus host network capture. John, does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, before we had to spoof the IP. Now we don't have any reason to spoof the IP. So, like, I don't think we ever, like, the old stuff never solved this problem, right? We couldn't say which network we bound to or which interface we're bound to.
Okay.
So the goal is to try to make sure I understand. The goal is to try to take the source IP that Z-Tunnel sees and to spoof that source IP on the outbound connection Z-Tunnel sends.
Yeah.
It's not even spoofing, you're just binding to
Yeah.
But isn't the application already bound to that port?
Well, you choose a different port,
address?
but you use the same IP address.
Oh, I
use
see.
a
I see.
different port.
Okay.
Because all the
Okay,
IP stuff is by address.
I see. So essentially, when Z-Tunnel sees traffic coming in from a source address that it doesn't recognize okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I just think we didn't think about the multi-NIC use case.
Yeah, it's fairly new. I think it's not really a typical use case. So I understand like why this isn't there, but for us, it would be really helpful because we have this distinction between where traffic within the pods network namespace comes from, and we want Z-Tunnel to honor that.
Yeah, it's not an uncommon use case, especially large enterprises where you'll have different NICs for public versus private. We see things like this. It's not necessarily relevant to Z-Tunnel specifically, but we see similar things with some AI use cases where there are different NICs that are being used for, different protocols or to access interconnect. I think NIC awareness for Z-Tunnels is going to generally be important for sort of the next step of adoption and use cases, even just as a, not even applying policy, but just as a proxy, forwarder at L4. I think solving this is going to be going to be useful.
Okay, that sounds good. And do you think the solution that I'm sort of talking about is enough to qualify as NIC awareness, or is there something I'm missing or more in depth?
I think where I come from, and this is just my opinion, I want to make sure, I want to get a good sense for what the end result looks like, because and what the scope is going to be. Because like the first step that I think is somewhat non-controversial is, oh, we can just respect the original source of the packet. I think that's pretty easy. But then, inevitably you can think about, okay, what if I want to enforce policy? What does that look like? What if you want to, like, I'm trying to just think about how it's not necessarily required for your specific use case. I think what you're proposing here seems fine. I'm just mindful of how is this going to evolve down the line. Because Kubernetes in general is doing some things around multi-NIC. There's a multi-network sub-project working group, something or other. And there's a pot network CRD that's coming down the pike. So like there's an open question here I've been thinking about at a high level, and this is relevant. I see, John, you're saying that auto detect multiple interfaces is likely to break something. Can you help me understand more about that?
Yeah, I don't think just the presence of 3 interfaces can have meaning. Like, I'm pretty sure there's all sorts of types of interfaces that mean all sorts of different things and have different behaviors. Like, there's one, not a ton, but something similar. I forget what it was. Like I don't know. But once you create it on the node, you get that device in every single network namespace. So all your network namespaces are not going to have 3 interfaces. But that interface is bogus. No one cares about it. Like, we shouldn't do anything with it.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure,
and you
sure,
could have
sure.
interfaces for all sorts of reasons, especially if we're talking about like off Kubernetes. So like, I don't have any issue with saying like, okay, we're gonna like opt in on this. Maybe it's even just a flag that says true and like auto detect. But I don't want to like break normal users to satisfy an advanced case, right? I think our auto detection probably can't just be you have 3 devices, right?
Yeah. I started with that auto detection just to get things going, but I after thinking about it more, I kind of am also on the same page, and I started abandoning that idea and in favor of just like a flag or something more simple because of the cases that you said. And I think also like the CNI ordering is not well defined, so I don't know if that would even work for our use case specifically. So yeah, I'm on the same page there too. But I did include that PR or that branch in this discussion tab, and I never removed it. But the eventual PR for infig change for this is not going to be that same method. It's going to be something more agreeable. Okay, I think it sounds like there's consensus. Go ahead.
I'm hearing general agreement. My thought is the only like open question is feature flag or not. And my guess is that's going to depend on implementation. If it's as simple as respecting the incoming bind, I struggle to imagine use cases where we want to explicitly not respect the incoming bind, and I could see not having that behind a feature flag. If on the other hand, we do need to do something more advanced, detecting multiple interfaces, etc., then potentially a feature flag. Does it sound like, am I reading the room right to say that the next steps are to see kind of a concrete pull request and then decide whether it goes behind a feature flag or not?
That's where I'm at.
Likewise.
Awesome. Did you want to talk about the other item then, Brendan?
Yes, please. So, oh, did you want me to share?
I think we might have lost Mitch, maybe.
Oh, okay. Let me share. So the other issue that we're sort of grappling with here is Envoy allowed us to do exclusions at different levels. And one reason we needed to do this exclusion was, so we have some of our customers still use this NFS v3, and there's a workflow within NFS v3 where a client establishes a connection, a privileged connection to the server in this privileged port range. And when inbound requests come into our storage component, which is a pod, and it comes in on this ETH1 interface, because zTunnel doesn't have an exclusion feature functionality, the request is redirected to zTunnel, and then zTunnel establishes the upstream request to the local application in the normal port range because there's no reason for it not to. And then the component will reject the request because it's not coming from a privileged port range like it did from the client. And this is kind of like a legacy functionality. NFS 4.1 does not do this, but we have a decent sized customer base that we need to try to support this with. So kind of as a way to unblock ourselves, we've created this init container that mimics the old exclusion where if a request comes in pre-routing on ETH1, we just jump out of the chain before going to Istio inbound or the equivalent with ambient. So I know there's a few threads around talking about wanting this functionality, and Mitch, I've talked to him offline and he's brought up maybe introducing it into the proxy config resource where it's more configurable by an admin and it's not a direct annotation on the pod. That's kind of a shared resource in the cluster. But I figured the first topic would be a little bit less controversial and this one might be a little bit harder to get across the line upstream, but just wondering what you all might think about this use case and how you see exclusion annotations.
Going to the use case, if I remember correctly, in this case, zTunnel does actually spoof the source IP and port. I think I could be wrong. That's what I remember, where the application sees the actual original address.
Yep, I think it's the address, but I believe it's not the port.
Oh, I see.
I think it just
Gotcha.
provides 0 as the port, so it lets the kernel or the network decide what to do. And I wasn't sure. I mean, I don't think that we want zTunnel to also honor the privileged port. That seems like not the right choice, but I could be wrong on that. For us, it's just easier to exclude the interface as a whole because the traffic isn't necessarily part of the mesh. It's coming from this network that's paired with the pod specifically, but it's not like a gateway, so it's not something that we establish MTLS through, originate through. So it's kind of this weird use case where exclusions have really helped us here. And I'd be open to suggestions otherwise, but that's kind of the issue we're dealing with.
I'm sorry, I may have missed this, but don't we have some interface exclusion thing in zTunnel already? Or is that it was for tail scale or like kubevert use cases? And I can't remember exactly what it does, but we have something in this multi-interface space on inbound. I think you treat it as outbound or something like that.
That's a different thing. That's like when you have nested interfaces, we treat it as. Yeah, sorry, actually, I haven't been paying that close attention, so maybe it's not a different thing, but it's not the same as excluding specifically. That's about like when you have nested interfaces, like a doctor and doctor.
Gotcha.
And then that it's actually outgoing traffic, but we would see it as incoming because we don't care. So then the flag flips it. But I think we do have just an entire exclude interface as well. But I could be wrong. I'd have to double check.
Is that controlled through the pod annotations?
All the stuff is pod annotations currently. All the inputs into the IP tables.
I thought when we discussed excluding pod annotations that we felt that was too much bypassability about 6 months ago.
That was in the context of excluding IP ranges and excluding ports. I think excluding interfaces is much less objectionable. Because you're essentially, to Brendan's point, you're essentially saying this is not a part of the mesh. And I think that's an easy argument to make from an interface perspective. Trying to think, how would ztunnel actually have to be in WDS? No, it wouldn't. It would be in the node, in the CNI. I just don't know if we actually respect it or not.
Yeah, okay. I'm just looking briefly, so I could still be wrong, but I think for ambient, we have what we call reroute interface, which is the inversion thing. And then for sidecars, we have exclude, but we don't have exclude for ambient.
Yeah.
Okay.
But is doing free bind connect and binding to whatever the original source port was, that seems fine to me.
I guess with that, I wasn't sure about the permissions required, and I didn't really go down that route yet.
We already have the permissions because we do, well, yeah, I think so. We already have the permissions in the net namespace to as cab admin to free bind for the inbound direction, assuming that the enable agent of source is on. So it's not a permission escalation in my mind, at least. I think it would certainly solve the use case. Something in me doesn't love the idea of doing that.
I mean, we're already doing it for the address. Like, is it
That's true for the
that much
default
difference
one.
to do it for the port?
Yeah, I guess I can play around with that. One other thing I was thinking was, like, if we just use the same port, if that port is taken for some reason, would we have to find a free one? And is there more logic around figuring that out that makes things a little bit more hairy versus just excluding the interface as a whole because we don't need it? But yeah, I think both solutions seem valid to me.
That was, I think, the other thing I was thinking about was the reuse piece. So we don't have to worry about that on for the address because we don't care about the port. But if we try to do the port too, well, I guess this is on inbound, right? So how would sorry, the previous issue was on I think outbound and this one is inbound, so I'm getting confused.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how
That would be
run into
possible.
a conflict. Yeah. Because it's an incoming connection.
Okay.
Regardless, I do think exclude interfaces is left for me to think about, and I think that seems fairly unobjectionable to me. Maybe others disagree, but I think that's a fairly easy lift.
So we do have some other things that features that I haven't indicated here that would benefit also from exclude interfaces. So I think that would be the preferred route to go as opposed to the binding on the address and reusing the same port the client used. So if that's okay, then I think I would pursue that solution.
Yeah, assuming no one else disagrees, I would just say respect the existing. I don't love the name of the annotation, but we do have an existing traffic Istio sidecar exclude interfaces or whatever. And I think it's fairly uncontroversial to just support that in ambient.
I would bring up some controversy. I do agree with what Mitch said. Like, if we are sticking by our prior guns that we want more non-bypassability in ambient, then there's no reason that excluding interfaces doesn't just completely destroy that, right? I can just say exclude all interfaces, and now I have total bypass. Now, we might be saying, maybe that's not a stance we need to maintain now, but if we are still keeping that stance, I do think that it needs to be a more mesh level control, right? And we have kind of this, in some sense, when we added that like mesh level label selector, whether it's enabled or not, like we did do that for kind of the same reason.
That's a good point on because it's an annotation, so that means the pod owner can set it. That's a good point.
So what I had originally proposed to Brendan, keeping that in mind, was that we look at proxy config as an API that can be distinctly RBAC'd, whether you're talking about proxy config at the pod level or at the mesh level. We can have our customers assign that to a security role and then have proxy config control the interface bypass. How does that land with you, Keith and John?
In my mind, proxy config and annotation are essentially the same thing, just because we have the resource, but that resource is essentially dead in my mind. And so you've got the proxy config annotation, which a pod owner can set.
When you say dead, can you help me understand that?
So it's the only thing in the networking Istio group that we did not promote to V1. It also is that the CRD itself is missing most of the fields that makes proxy config as a configuration API useful. There's very little in there in the CRD. And I think when we were talking about promotion like 2 years ago, the consensus was that proxy config, that I remember at least, people can correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection was that proxy config was essentially seen as an API that was a mistake.
Yeah, it's also kind of like for configuring a proxy, and if then you're attaching it to a pod that has no proxy directly, it's a little bit awkward. But I think as long as there is a mesh level control involved, then we're in good shape. Whether that's even at the laziest level, and maybe that's fine. It's literally just an environment variable. It says enable pods to exclude interfaces or something, or something along those lines.
Yeah, can we start with simple? Maybe just enable this on the mesh-wide level without going to individual pod. Do we need to go to individual pod in your case?
No, because the pod that would have it, other pods would not have it, and it would just be ignored basically. So I don't see an issue with that.
Okay, yeah, because I really like to start simple. I don't like the annotation we have because right now it starts with sidecar. Also, if we give this annotation to the whoever deploys the pod or deployment, then they could, opt out of governance of the mesh, which you may not want to.
Mm-hmm.
So for mesh-wide configuration, are we talking like mesh config?
Mesh config is tough because mesh config is reloadable. And I don't know. I don't love that dynamic aspect to it when it comes to things like this, excluding interfaces from the mesh.
Because the exclusion has to happen at pod startup time via the CNI, right?
I mean, in theory, yes, unless you want to do a bunch of like IP tables reconciliation horribleness while the pod is running, and that's just not great. So I would say we have some CNI environment variables or configuration in the node agent, like ambient enablement selectors. This feels very similar. It's a static thing when the CNI comes up. The mesh admin is the one who has permissions to set this configuration. And it the actual place that this would get applied is in the CNI's IP tables and F tables rules that it writes to the pot net nest anyway, so it's close to where the logic would live. So that would be my initial thought about where this could live.
Yeah, I'm with that. I think environment variable makes sense for the stage, especially I think you are asking if we have more people asking, we can look into if it makes sense to promote beyond environment variable.
I think I'll give my perspective as a vendor is just that we have tended towards not having our users control install time parameters. We've tended to draw the line at each of the vendors that I've worked at, that the runtime config is user configurable and the install time config is vendor or cloud provider configurable. That would be a little bit problematic in this case.
But do you have most of user needs to config this? That's the thing.
No, what I'm saying is that we have one user that needs to configure this and 1,000 other users that need to not have it configured. And because it's an install time parameter, that's a bit of a challenge.
But I'm
can't-
very hesitant to put in a config if only one user asks for it. Carsten.
Just a small comment here. The simplest thing is probably not to have a mesh-wide setting or impact the entire mesh for something new that is not. And while proxy config, I don't know, was not promoted for some reasons that we may disagree on. The point here is that what we want to do is to configure the behavior of the proxy, which happens to be zTunnel and happens to be, you know, per node, but it's still impacting a specific pod. It's a pretty dangerous thing to allow or not allow mesh-wide something that has security implication when only one specific pod needs it. So I don't know if resurrecting proxy config or putting something in mesh config, but that is specific to at least namespace, if not pod, wouldn't be safer and simpler actually, if you consider the full picture of you know, how much you can break accidentally by because we don't know what the implication, we don't know what other people are doing. One user will be happy, but who knows what other users will be very unhappy when some backdoor happens to this.
Mhm.
But it's not actually, I have to push back a little bit. In my mind, it's not the behavior of the proxy, it's the behavior of the redirection logic, right? Before the traffic even gets to the proxy, we were saying, don't send it to the proxy, right? And so from that perspective, it feels appropriate for it to be mesh-wide. Because that's where redirection.
I don't know how you define proxy, but everything happening from client originating a connection to going to the final destination, it's part of the proxy. It doesn't matter how it's physically represented. And mesh-wide firewall settings are probably the most dangerous things that we can do at any point. That's my personal opinion. You know, just.
So I wonder, we've got some alternatives and each of them have proponents and detractors, some rough edges. But the original option that we discussed, pod annotations, the reason that it was concerning was from a security bypass perspective. However, Keith pointed out that validating admission policy means that administrators can actually control what annotations are set on a pod by pod basis. Is that a viable solution for us to say that this, like the life cycle of the redirection is coupled with the pod? So having this on the pod object makes a lot of sense from that perspective. If we then protect the bypass using VAP or instruct administrators to do so, does that solve the security concern?
Part of, I will say, like on the security side, we've gotten a lot of bugs about escalations from one setting on a pod to settings on pods they shouldn't have. And So we would need to be very hardened against that if we were saying that, that's how you secure yourself in that. The
Is it just me or is John going in and out?
Yeah, I'm losing John's audio.
I'm sorry. That's right. It wasn't very coherent, anyways. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know.
What I heard from John was that and I can attest to this, like we've seen reports about like users consider a security incident or security vulnerability in some cases if you can have a pod annotation that you can get a pod annotation that has results in something that you don't intend, or where like admins are doing. The situation was that admins are essentially doing security policy enforcement using validation, and so having things like that was considered having annotations that misbehaved was considered a security vulnerability. I think our position in the PSWG was that it wasn't a vulnerability, but I do wonder about just more control, having more knobs there, and the implications of that, especially in ambient. I like Ian's comment from the chat around like a CNI variable that sets the label. I think we've been creating APIs that are doing selection like this, and I think that that's been fairly useful. Where similar to ambient enablement selectors, we allow the admin to say, "Hey, here's the label that will be used to determine what traffic is bypassed or not," and we'll honor that at install time. That feels like a nice collaboration.
It also gets us away from having to use the word sidecar.
Big +1 to that.
And I suppose that can be coupled with VAP or security controls so that it doesn't have to be a cluster-wide set. It's a cluster-wide setting in terms of the label name. It's not a cluster-wide setting in terms of administrators can still have fine-grained control over which pods can and cannot set that label.
Right.
I also like that, but I wonder, should we just enable that at namespace level first? Is that sufficient as far as boundary? Because I'm thinking about today, I enable my ambient at namespace level, and if I have a particular interface I want to opt out, can I do it also just on the namespace? Would that be sufficient most of the case?
That ends up being a lot of config to go into CNI install time params.
Well, it's the same config, right? So basically, it's the same config at the install time that we're all saying it allow admin to set the label key, and initially we can support opt out the interface at namespace level. And I think it should be sufficient in most of the scenario. And then furthermore, if down the road, if people want it at a pod level, we could potentially support that, but I just don't. I'd rather not support if we don't need it.
In my mind, it's the same exact basically level of config to do namespace versus pod. Right? This is what ambient enablement selectors already does, right? And so if we're going to do namespace control or pod control, in my mind, it sort of makes sense to do both. Maybe that's controversial.
Yeah, it is the same. The only thing is the logic is pretty complex to understand because I think there was a long table of how the overrides works between pod and namespace level.
I mean, yes, but the benefit, I prefer, like from a maintainer perspective, I think it would be a nice benefit if we were just able to reuse existing methods to do it, so that we know that it's got the same effects versus having some enablements, things that are just namespace, some that are just pod, some that are namespace and pod. I think consistency is what makes it more predictable for users from a user experience perspective. These are all things, let me walk all the way back. I think these are all things that we can figure out at PR time when we see the actual code. Cooling the room a bit, it seems like we are in favor of exposing this. There seems to be, people seem to like the idea of having a CNI variable that sets a label selector at some granularity, and the details of whether that's namespace or pod or both, I think can probably be discussed in a PR once we see what it looks like. Any disagreement with that or other context? Okay. In that case, I think that's general thumbs up to move forward. Mitch, I'll turn it back to you. I think we've got one more topic on the agenda.
We do. Christian has shared a follow-up to the metrics comparison. Oh, it looks like I'm not sharing my screen after I got kicked out. Let me try this again. It sounds like there's some follow-up work to be done on metrics compression because they are not compressed as they leave the agent. Probably due to merge semantics in the agent, it looks like. I'm not clear on what Christian's ask is here.
I can talk to this. So basically, the last couple of weeks we've been talking about having Envoy do compression. However, that does not apply when we are doing metric merging. So what is metric merging? Basically, when the user's application has metrics and Envoy has metrics, metric merging allows Istio's sidecar to serve them all at one endpoint and aggregate them. And so that currently happens through, we rewrite the ports on the, actually the ports don't matter. We rewrite some of the like probes and, no, that's probes. I'm mixing up probes and merging. But basically, yes, there's an endpoint where you can get all of the metrics from both the application and the and Envoy sidecar served on one endpoint. And the metric compression discussion that we've been having does not apply to those merged metrics.
So it sounds like that's expected behavior.
It's, yeah, expected in the sense that we have not wired up the code to do it, not expected from a UX perspective. If I've got a stats compression annotation turned on, I would expect all of my stats to be compressed, whether or not I'm using merging or not. And so the ask here is there are two different approaches. One is to have Envoy have a route where Envoy serves all the merged metric stuff instead of Pilot Agent. The other option is to just do the gzip compression inside of Pilot Agent. And the PR talks about, and there are two, the issue has links to two different branches that implement both implementations. Hopefully that helps. Sorry, I butchered a bit of the description.
That's all right. So do we need a decision between these two PRs? Is that the idea?
I think there was some discussion about this being added into 129, but I think, and we discussed async, that this is a new feature and has implications as far as what's doing the serving. So it's not in scope for 129. The other open question was, are we okay with doing this? And in my mind, I think it's really reasonable to do compression everywhere, especially since we've got an annotation, people to opt into it. What else? Oh, and then, yeah, weighing in on which of the two options is preferable. And I think that can be done in the issue. There's also a Slack thread if folks are interested.
Okay. So it sounds like that's an FYI for the purposes of today's meeting. And that gives us 5 minutes to discuss Rajat's question about migrating to Gateway API from the more traditional Istio APIs. Rajat, did you want to speak to this?
Like it is what the statement says basically. So we are already running like a Istio setup, and I asked this in a gateway API call also. I'm basically looking into some sort of guides or maybe like gotchas, anything around it before we dive into it head first. And so I guess it's a two-part question. A, does something like this already exist? And B, if it doesn't, then is the community interested in us sharing our findings when we go through this whole process?
I think a definite yes to that second question. We would always love to have users who have hands-on experience doing migrations or working with the Istio project share those findings to the rest of the community. Zero concern or opposition from me on that. As for migration help, as Ricardo mentions in the chat, there is a project called Ingress to Gateway that was originally built to try to help folks migrate away from the Ingress API over to Gateway API. I believe there was some work done in that project early on to migrate from Istio virtual service and stuff to Gateway API. And Ricardo's confirmed that there is some stuff that's already there. So it's early. I don't think it was ever fully completed, but if you're looking for some sort of automated help, Ingress Gateway is a great place to start. And I know that project would definitely appreciate contributions, and it'll be something that we can recommend more broadly as well.
Yep. Cool.
Out of curiosity, Rajat, what is your motivation for migration? Are you looking to just be on the Kubernetes standard? Are you looking to use ambient and therefore need Gateway API? Are there any Gateway API features looking for specifically? What's the motivation for you folks?
Yeah, so it's basically multifaceted. So the context here is I work for booking.com, and we were using like an in-house service mesh till very recently. We have gone through like a year-long process to migrate over to Istio. It's still in process. We're still figuring things out, but we are also looking forward to using stuff like K-Gateway and Agent Gateway and all of that. And since Istio also plans to do Gateway API as a standard thing in the future, it seems like the right idea to just do it right now.
Gotcha, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Cool. So like on my side, I'll basically go through the reference that Ricardo shared, and I'll probably reach out over Slack if something comes up.
Yeah, there is sorry. Yeah, Steven is the right person to speak, actually.
Oh, sorry. No, if you're talking about Ingress to Gateway, you should go ahead.
I was just going to say that there is a channel on Kubernetes Lab for Ingress to Gateway that you are taking care of, actually. So, the best way to take a look into.
Yeah, I'll also add that I don't know, a lot of people when they migrate, they worry about like changing their IPs or this and that. I'm not sure, but something else you probably want to keep in mind is that you can attach a Kubernetes gateway to an Istio gateway, and that might be helpful. Yeah.
Cool. I think it's like both for us. It's gateways plus also like the mesh part of it.
I see.
Exploring both of them separately. Again, just to see like what would fit best.
All right.
That's it from us.
Do we have any other last minute agenda items or questions? Okay, well, with that, thank you all, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.